We close, as we always do on Friday, with the works of the great James Thurber. Tonight I read, as always, from the Library of America, Thurber, Writings and Drawings, edited by Garrison Keillor. This story was first published in My Life in Hard Times in 1933. It's Thurber's exaggerated, but only slightly exaggerated, story of the March day in 1913 when he and other residents of the dry half of the flooded city of Columbus, Ohio, became inexplicably convinced that the dam had broken. We rejoin pure mindless panic already in progress in the conclusion of The Day the Dam Broke by James Thurber. 2,000 people were abruptly in full flight. "Go east," was the cry that arose. "East, away from the river, east to safety. Go east, go east, go east." Black streams of people flowed eastward down all the streets leading in that direction. These streams, whose headwaters were in the dry goods stores, office buildings, harness shops, movie theaters, were fed by trickles of housewives, children, cripples, servants, dogs, and cats, slipping out of the houses past which the main streams flowed, shouting and screaming. People ran out, leaving fires burning and food cooking and doors wide open. I remember, however, that my mother turned out all the fires and that she took with her a dozen eggs and 2 loaves of bread. It was her plan to make Memorial Hall just 2 blocks away and take refuge somewhere in the top of it, in one of the dusty rooms where war veterans met and where old battle flags and stage scenery were stored. But the seething throng shouting, "Go east," drew her along and the rest of us with her. When Grandfather regained full consciousness at Parsons Avenue, he turned upon the retreating mob like a vengeful prophet and exhorted the men to form ranks and stand off the rebel dogs. But at length he too got the idea that the dam had broken, and roaring, "Go east," in his powerful voice, he caught up in one arm a small child and in the other a slight clerkish man of perhaps 42, and we slowly began to gain on those ahead of us. A scattering of firemen, policemen, and army officers in dress uniforms, there'd been a review at Fort Hays in the northern part of town, added color to the surging billows of people. "Go east," cried a little child in a piping voice as she ran past a porch on which drowsed a lieutenant colonel of infantry. Used to quick decisions, trained to immediate obedience, the officer bounded off the porch and, running at full tilt, soon passed the child, bawling, "Go east." The 2 of them emptied rapidly the houses of the little street they were on. "What is it? What is it?" demanded a fat, waddling man who intercepted the colonel. The officer dropped behind and asked the little girl what it was. "The dam has broke," gasped the girl. "The dam has broke," roared the colonel. "Go east! Go east! Go east!" He was soon leading, with the exhausted child in his arms, a fleeing company of 300 persons who had gathered around him from living rooms, shops, garages, backyards, and basements. Nobody has ever been able to compute with any exactness how many people took part in the great rout of 1913, for the panic, which extended from the Winslow bottling works in the South End to Clintonville, 6 miles north, ended as abruptly as it began, and the bobtail and ragtag and velvet-gowned groups of refugees melted away and slunk home, leaving the streets peaceful and deserted. The shouting, weeping, tangled evacuation of the city lasted not more than 2 hours in all. Some few people got as far east as Reynoldsburg, 12 miles away. 50 or more reached the country club, 8 miles away. Most of the others gave up exhausted or climbed trees in Franklin Park, 4 miles out. Order was restored and fear dispelled finally by means of militiamen riding about in motor lorries, brawling through megaphones. "The dam has not broken." At first, this tended only to add to the confusion and increase the panic, for many stampeders thought that the soldiers were bellowing, "The dam has now broken," and then setting an official seal of authentication on the calamity. All the time, the sun shone quietly and there was nowhere any sign of the oncoming waters. A visitor in an airplane looking down on the straggling, agitated masses of people below would have been hard put to it to divine a reason for the phenomenon. It must have inspired in such an observer a peculiar kind of terror, like the sight of the Marie Celeste, abandoned at sea, its galley fires peacefully burning, its tranquil decks bright in the sunlight. An aunt of mine, Aunt Edith Taylor, was in a movie theater on High Street when, over and above the sound of the piano in the pit, a William S. Hart picture was being shown. There rose the steadily increasing tromp of running feet. Persistent shouts rose above the tromping. An elderly man sitting near my aunt mumbled something, got out of his seat, and went up the aisle at a dog trot. This started everybody. In an instant, the audience was jamming the aisles. "Fire!" shouted a woman who always was expecting to be burned up in a theater. But now the shouts outside were louder and coherent. "The dam has broke!" cried somebody. "Go east!" screamed a small woman in front of my aunt. And east they went, pushing and shoving and clawing, knocking women and children down, emerging finally into the street, torn and sprawling. Inside the theater, Bill Hart was calmly calling some desperado's bluff, and the brave girl at the piano played "Row, Row, Row" loudly, and then "In My Harem." Outside, men were streaming across the State House yard. Others were climbing trees. A woman managed to get up into the "These Are My Jewels" statue, whose bronze figures of Sherman, Stanton, Grant, and Sheridan watched with cold unconcern the going to pieces of the capital city. I ran south to State Street, east on State to 3rd, south on 3rd to Town, and out east on Town, my Aunt Edith has written me. A tall, spare woman with grim eyes and a determined chin ran past me down the middle of the street. I was still uncertain as to what was the matter in spite of all the shouting. I drew up alongside the woman with some effort, for although she was in her late 50s, she had a beautiful, easy-running form and seemed to be in excellent condition. What is it?" I puffed. She gave me a quick glance and then looked ahead again, stepping up her pace a trifle. "Don't ask me. Ask God." When I reached Grant Avenue, I was so spent that Dr. H.R. Mallory, you remember Dr. Mallory, the man with the white beard who looks like Robert Browning? Well, Dr. Mallory, whom I had drawn away from at the corner of 5th and Town, passed me. "It's got us," he shouted, and I felt sure that whatever it was did have us, for you know what conviction Dr. Mallory's statements always carried. I didn't know at the time what he meant, but I found out later. There was a boy behind him on roller skates, and Dr. Mallory mistook the swishing of the skates for the sound of rushing water. He eventually reached the Columbus School for Girls at the corner of Parsons Avenue and Town Street, where he collapsed, expecting the cold, frothing waters of the Scioto to sweep him into oblivion. The boy on the skates swirled past him, and Dr. Mallory realized for the first time what he had been running from. Looking back up the street, he could see no signs of water, but nevertheless, after resting just a few minutes, he jogged on east again. He caught up with me at Ohio Avenue, where we rested together. I should say that about 700 people passed us. A funny thing was that all of them were on foot. Nobody seemed to have had the courage to stop and start his car. But as I remember it, all cars had to be cranked in those days, which is probably the reason. The next day, the city went about its business as if nothing had happened, but there was no joking. It was 2 years or more before you dared treat the breaking of the dam lightly. And even now, 20 years later, there are a few persons, like Dr. Mallory, who will shut up like a clam if you mention the afternoon of the Great Run. The Day the Dam Broke by James Thurber. That's September 24th. I'm Keith Olbermann. Good night and good luck. And now to discuss the ruling that a major discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell must be reinstated. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Rachel Maddow. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Keith. Go east indeed. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thanks to you at home for staying with us for the next hour as well.